Welcome. We're going to get started. Thanks for joining us today. I am Zack Subin, an Associate Research Director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, and I'm very excited to be leading our new Housing and Climate Research Initiative. First, I do want to thank the Wells Fargo Foundation for their support in seeding this new research initiative. And I also want to give a shout out to Carolina Rhie, our faculty advisor, as well as the other Terner staff who have provided so much help in getting this initiative off the ground. A few housekeeping items before we start. We will be taking questions today via the Q&A feature. So please drop your questions there and we'll spend some time at the end answering audience questions. This conversation will be recorded and it will be available on our website along with the slides that I'm about to share. So here's some context for today's topic. The state of California has very ambitious climate targets and time is running short. Passenger vehicles are by far the largest single source of carbon pollution in the state. And despite more than a decade of policy focus, progress has been limited. After a brief pandemic dip in 2020, transportation has rebounded, and the most recent data suggests we're just about back to pre-pandemic levels of miles driven per person. Spoiler, we will talk about this some more, but remote work did not save us, nor can we wait for electric vehicles to save us, as those are a necessary but insufficient solution on their own. One of the key challenges is that we're just not building enough new homes. And specifically, not enough new homes are being built in the places where people are able to drive less. So in the next few slides, I'll briefly preview this topic with some examples from the commentary that I published last week. So how can we reduce carbon pollution with new housing? Well, it's widely known that people in cities drive less, but the magnitude of the opportunity to reduce pollution is less well understood. So here we're illustrating this using current travel estimates from Replica based on smartphone location data. So this map shows vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, per person per day from just a year ago in the spring of 2023. You can see the dark blue areas in the urban core have the lowest VMT, while the red areas and outlying suburbs have the highest VMT. You will notice, however, that not all suburban locations are the same. So let's dig into this now with 4 example cities. In addition to SF, we'll discuss Palo Alto in the heart of Silicon Valley, Hayward in the East Bay, and Oakley in eastern Contra Costa County, not to be confused with Oakland. These 3 suburbs have very different travel patterns, even though they have just about the same population density, much lower than SF. But you can see on the right that Palo Alto residents drive half as much as residents of outlying Oakley. And this leads to large differences in carbon pollution. For instance, the difference between Oakley and SF would amount to a quarter of the carbon pollution from the average Californian from all sectors, not just transportation. So what explains these differences? Well, it's not because people are traveling for different reasons. In fact, people are traveling in these cities for roughly the same reasons and at the same frequency. Here we're showing daily trips with trips to work in black at the bottom and light blue at the top showing trips returning home from work and from the other destinations shown. Most daily travel is not associated with commutes, but with the other activities of daily life, going out to get food, dropping kids at school, and shopping. Instead, what varies across these 4 cities is what transportation modes are available to people and how far they have to travel to reach their destinations. First, in SF, people use transit frequently, and people in both SF and Palo Alto walk and bike to destinations regularly. Second, Moving left on the graph, we see decreases in typical trip distances. What this means is that in Palo Alto, even though there's very little use of transit and most trips are by car, destinations are still close enough together that people don't have to drive as far when they do get in their cars. What this suggests is an opportunity to build housing in lower VMT locations beyond transit corridors, including some wealthy single-family neighborhoods that have so far excluded more affordable housing types. And this analysis is just the beginning of our exploration with Terner Center's new Housing and Climate Research Initiative. Please be sure to follow us, go to our website, and you can sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on research and events. So we'll start the conversation today. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Rhie, and then I'll turn it over to him to lead our conversation.
Thank you, Zack, for the warm introduction. And thank you to the Terner Center for the opportunity to moderate today's discussion. Sorry, Zack.
I was going to read your bio.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
So Chris is founder and principal of Rhie Planning. As a consulting urban planner, Chris has over 15 years of experience shaping equitable, place-based strategies to combat global climate change. He is a nationally recognized expert on urban sustainability, working with leading cities and regions across the US and advising NGOs, including C40 Cities, the Global Covenant of Mayors, and US Green Building Council. Chris has the distinct privilege of leading New York City's long-range climate action plan, as well as the award-winning LA County Sustainability Plan, widely recognized as the nation's boldest, most inclusive regional sustainability strategy.
Okay, I'll jump in here. And as you can all tell, I jumped the gun because I'm just so excited for today's conversation as it grapples with today's incredibly ambitious goals in California for new housing, more sustainable transportation, and carbon neutrality. And while our state is known for setting ambitious targets, we're presented with a maze of challenges and opportunities, as well as entrenched interests that can sometimes stand in the way of change. I think it's also notable that with regards to greenhouse gas emissions, most of the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, which means that reducing carbon pollution is only going to get more challenging from here. Infill and denser housing is widely recognized as a key strategy to reduce emissions, but it's amongst the most challenging to implement. And the dream of living in walkable neighborhoods is out of reach for so many Californians. Our panel today spans research and practice, and these diverse perspectives promise to enrich our understanding of these issues and what actions we must take to bridge the gap between our ambitious goals and current reality. I'd like to express my gratitude to our panelists joining us today and all of you in the audience for engaging in this discussion as we work towards a more sustainable and equitable future for California. And without further ado, allow me to introduce our panelists. First, we have Susan Handy. Susan is a professor at UC Davis in the Department for Environmental Science and Policy. As the director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, her research delves into the connection between transportation and land use with a focus on strategies to reduce automobile dependence. Notably, she's involved in projects for the California Air Resources Board and Caltrans to evaluate the impacts of vehicle travel of proposed land development and transportation projects. Susan's new book, Shifting Gears Towards a New Way of Thinking About Transportation, is available for order from your local independent bookstore. Next, we have James Corless, who is the Executive Director of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG. Under his leadership, SACOG has created a national model for infill development through the innovative Green Means Go program. He's played a key role in securing over $1 billion in state funding for local transportation projects, initiated the Civic Lab Government Solutions Accelerator, and led the creation of a 1,000-mile regional trails vision. James has also contributed significantly to SACOG's Racial Equity Framework and Action Plan, a Youth Leadership Academy, and a Regional Economic Prosperity Strategy. And next we have Grecia Mannah-Ayon. Grecia is the Housing Policy Manager at Transform. There she engages with other advocacy organizations, public agencies, and elected officials to create and implement programs and policies that support affordable housing in connected communities. With diverse experience in regional government, philanthropy, and technical assistance, her work has included supporting the Regional Early Action Planning Grants, or REAP program at MTC, providing technical assistance for the state's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, and designing a grant program for Hope SF's public housing resident-led groups. Welcome, everyone. So to kick off this conversation, Zack presented our introductory slides. And Susan, I want to start with you. How does what Zack presented mesh with the state of transportation and land use research today?
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, Zack's very brief overview of the data is very consistent with what is by now decades of research looking at this question of the connection between land development and travel behavior. So it's well established that higher density mixed use development with good infrastructure for active modes of travel is associated with less driving after controlling for socio-demographic factors. If you're interested in learning more about this research, I suggest that you Google SB 375 research, and you will find a bunch of work that a team led by myself and Marlon Bornett, who's now at USC, did for the California Resources Board about a decade ago. And we are currently working to update all of those summaries of the evidence in a project that's being led by Dylan Fitch. So lots of evidence. The caveat I do want to mention is that most of this research is cross-sectional. So what it does is show that places with more compact development have less VMT on average per person. But that is not the same as showing that changing development patterns leads to a change in VMT. And part of the issue here is the question of self-selection and who is choosing to live in those more compact neighborhoods. So what we really need are longitudinal studies. Those are just much harder to do. We don't have a lot of them. Marlon's done some of this work in Southern California. We just completed a study for CARB that looked at 3 case studies in California. But the big issue from a research standpoint is that we just do not have very good data about VMT for small areas over time. So it's really hard to prove that changes going on in communities in California are having an impact on VMT. And then, of course, the really big issue is, okay, if we think that this is going to work, how do we do it? And that's where James and Grecia can be more helpful than I.
So I suppose the answer to the question, if we build it, will they drive less? Is that the right analogy? We don't quite know yet.
Well, we have good reason to believe that's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And James, given what we know from the research community and the ambitious climate goals that California has, what's taking so long to accelerate infill housing?
Thanks, Chris. That's a great question. And I by the way, I do think we know that if we build it, they will drive less. And that's thanks to just, I mean, a lot of the data that Zack showed, cell phone data, replica. It's what's incredibly powerful now. We can actually really look at travel patterns. Like Susan said, it's harder to dig down into smaller communities for sure. But I mean, just to ground people, so we're the Sacramento area. We're 6 counties. We start kind of at UC Davis and go all the way to Lake Tahoe, and then down in the Sacramento Delta and all the way up to Yuba City, Marysville, and lots of rural and ag in our region. And we desperately want more infill housing. And we know that actually there's a lot of even our smaller communities where we have lower VMT for all kinds of reasons. What's taking so long, I think, is at least for in our situation, we kind of have one foot in the Bay Area economy. We're getting a lot of people moving here from the Bay Area and driving up housing prices, and we have one foot in the Central Valley economy, which actually makes, even though housing prices are going up, the cost of construction is still really high. We're kind of paying Bay Area cost of construction. So and then we lost this great tool, really important tool called redevelopment about 14 years ago in California. And so literally our infill at the moment only pencils and about 10 or 20% of our region. And so we're trying to, with our Green Means Go program, underwrite the cost, write down the risk. We're trying to take the cost of a lot of things developers typically have to do, like water, sewer, utility upgrades, off the books of housing developers and affordable housing developers, trying to publicly fund those and publicly subsidize those external costs so that more infill and affordable can pencil in more places. But we have a lot of infill on the books and in our general plans, and there's lots of other reasons, but the big one that we're just trying to work on is the economics and getting the development community, for profit or nonprofit, getting it to pencil for them.
Great, thank you, James. And you mentioned the Bay Area in your remarks and how that is rippling out to the Sacramento area. Grecia, I think that's a great opportunity for you to jump in and ask, how does all this mesh with what you're seeing in the Bay Area?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris, for the question. I think we all feel the impacts every day, whether you're enmeshed in the field or are working on this actively. The levels of homelessness are sky high. Folks are being pushed out further and further, which I suspect is why it's also down or trickling up into the Sacramento area as well. Developers, construction costs are sky high. So as you know, a couple of us before this webinar, we're talking about how buildings will start to go up and then they have to stop because of financing. Financing, particularly for affordable housing, is incredibly competitive and comes with a lot of strings attached. So then even if you are able to secure the financing, it's tough to continue to get all of it becomes like a package deal in terms of getting all of that in order to be able to build. So there are these barriers to be able to build in the Bay Area incredibly high. And then we also have, when we do have these investments in terms of housing and transportation, if it's not bundled with really meaningful protections for residents and renters, folks can get displaced. So there's, we're all saying, I have hope, we are making progress, but there are barriers that all of us live every day, living here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, thank you for your response there. I'm wondering, some of the things that you mentioned are not necessarily part of the public dialogue, or it doesn't come up very often that financing is the major hurdle, or that there are other things getting in the way. What are some common public misconceptions about infill housing, about sustainable transportation, that are getting in the way of progress? And I'll open to that for anyone who wants to take it first.
Yeah, so just to make sure I am following the question is, why is it not in the public consciousness in terms of financing being really difficult? I think that there is a perception that production is happening because there are, especially in the higher density areas in the Bay Area, construction is happening, but it's not always for the income levels that it's most needed. A lot of times it's for the higher income levels. And, sometimes folks, when it's voting time and they see things on the ballot, potentially they feel as though there's like a misconception because you voted on something maybe a year ago or a couple of years ago that there is financing, but it's like a drop in the bucket of what we need, which is why this regional housing measure that's coming in November is of critical importance. But I do also want to add here that there is, I think, in addition to the financing, if we're on the topic of public consciousness, this need for a cultural shift in terms of, this question that was brought up earlier, if they build it, will they come? So that folks, we have the infrastructure and the resources and the community amenities so that folks will drive less because they can and they want to.
Yeah, I think you can't talk about infill development without talking about NIMBYism, that there is this gut reaction against change in one's own community. And, a lot of motivations behind that. But of course, a lot of the concern is that infill development will increase congestion and make parking harder. And the challenge here is that may be true for a while, but there's also some threshold beyond which things actually get a lot better. And the higher densities you have, the more services you can have within close proximity, walking and biking become more possible. And so, there may be some sort of immediate effects on congestion in that area, but the net effect could be a significant reduction in VMT. I mean, just think about San Francisco. There's a lot of traffic there, yet people are driving a lot less. And if that infill development creates the possibility of getting what you need without driving, then you don't really care if the streets are congested.
Yeah, I think what we tend to have, it seems, are a lot of misconceptions on kind of both ends, right? I think on one side, we're talking about, there's going to be parking Armageddon if we have infill housing, and so you need to oversupply, and of course that drives up. We still have a lot of requirements for local parking, which we're trying to work with our local governments to relax those and get those off the books. That's one of the things that drives up the cost. But on the other side, and again, we're a very largely suburban region in the Sacramento area, and so we don't have transit everywhere. And we know there's places we build housing, people drive fewer miles, but they will still have cars. So there is a need to understand that in some communities there is really still a demand for parking, and in those situations, we are trying to figure out how can we provide more EV car share, especially even on our affordable housing projects, because transportation and housing are the two highest household costs, especially when you get lower income. So we are going to need, it's harder to say that either of these extremes are always the case. And it's more for us, it's really kind of a case-by-case basis, and trying to make sure that parking requirements aren't unnecessarily making housing more expensive.
And Grecia, you've had some experience with these conversations around parking, which can be such a emotional issue for so many people.
Oh yeah. Here at Transform, we love to talk about parking. We've been the parking people for maybe 20 some years. I mean, the fact of the matter is that parking is making affordable, and I speak about affordable housing, that's our focus. Like, it is making affordable housing developments not pencil. It is significantly contributing to the cost of building, right? But I agree that it can be case by case. Communities can look and come in many different shapes, and maybe not everybody wants to live in like the San Franciscos of the world. But I don't think that means that we can't move towards right size parking. So, we do experience, at least here in the Bay Area, communities or cities where the parking ratio is actually much higher than when is needed. And, not to call it San Jose, I love San Jose. This is where we're working, and I speak to it because that is the local example where we're going in pretty deep. In their downtown area, for example, they have, it is not an exaggeration, about 30 parking garages, and they are never more than 30% full. And that is based on like live data that goes directly to the city. However, there is still a perception that there is traffic and not enough parking. And this is very much like a narrative issue, potentially a cultural shift that needs to happen, because folks, I get it. I have 2 young children. I don't always want to drive into a parking garage and load up the stroller and then walk, but it is, I think, potentially more accessible than we think it is to just go around the corner and park in the parking garage, and there is enough car storage for folks, at least in this specific example. So part of our charge is like, how do we bring folks along, whether that's incrementally, because we know what a barrier parking can be. We also know that it could be an issue in terms of someone's economic means. We don't want to take that away from anybody. And we also recognize that in some areas, the transit is potentially just not there yet, and they still need this piece.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the note on transit, and James mentioned this as well, and ask Susan. There's been so much attention from state legislators on transit-oriented development as really being the key lens by which we look at growth. How do we think about growth in our suburbs across the state, and where is it best targeted?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons to think about suburban development in a transit-oriented development sort of way. We may not have the high-quality transit service in a lot of the suburban areas that you find in more inner, not just urban areas, but older suburban areas, right? Like ringing the Bay Area. But even if transit isn't really going to be a big player in those areas, there are a lot of reasons to increase densities and provide a better mix of land uses, because that also helps to make walking and biking more possible. I'm a big fan of e-bikes. I think they have a lot of potential for filling in where transit service is sparse, especially given California's great weather. So I think that's part of the answer, but of course that means making sure we improve biking infrastructure so that people feel safe getting around that way. And then, of course, we've got to think also about what's happening beyond the suburban areas and the issues if we continue to sprawl outward. Not only is that an inefficient consumption of land, whether it's agricultural land or wild land, but then we also, that's just exacerbating the problem of the wildland-urban interface. And issues like wildfire risk. So, of course, I'm an academic, so a little bit ivory tower, but compact development really, I think, really important for so many different reasons. VMT reduction being one of them, but lots of other reasons as well. And, I'm lucky to live in a place like Davis, where we do have a lot of options about getting around other than driving. And in fact, we have surprisingly high residential densities, if you just look at the numbers, for what feels like a suburban community. And Davis has done a lot of things right, not everything right, but I think it's proof that with good land use policies, you can create a suburban sort of place that gives people transportation options. Not that it's affordable, that's the other big problem, but there's some possibility.
I think there's a couple of different suburban contexts or suburban small town contexts in our region that I think are really interesting and very applicable across the state. One is, and I think we've gotten some of these questions in the Q&A here, these old commercial corridors. So strip malls and retail that's struggling, and we have tons and tons of commercial corridors in our region. Really, the Sacramento region kind of boomed in the post-war 50s, 60s, and 70s. With a lot of military bases here. We boomed that period. We kind of got all of that kind of the built infrastructure and environment, and now they're struggling. So in many ways, there's a lot of underutilized land, vacant property, vacant strip malls that are perfect to rehabilitate into housing. Again, these are some of the places that are tougher to pencil. And But there also are where we want to actually get our bus service up to higher frequencies, and we're looking for dedicated BRT. But as Susan was just saying, the bicycling and pedestrian environment is terrible. It is completely unsafe, right? So we need a lot of love for all these old suburban arterials because they're a huge, huge opportunity. The other one I want to mention is really interestingly, because people think our VMT map goes like lowest VMT in the urban core and then further and further out, the further out you get from the urban core. And that is not how our region looks. In fact, some of our lowest VMT in our region are smaller cities of Yuba City and Marysville. And up there, it's a very, very farming and ag community with a lot of services, about an hour north of downtown Sacramento. Total population, about 140,000 between the two cities. But they're surrounded by a natural greenbelt, floodplain. You can't build. And so lots of people drive, but they all drive about 5 or 10 minutes to get everything they need. And actually, if you look, and it's again shown up on Replica and showing up in cell phone data, outside of downtown Sacramento, that's some of the lowest VMT we have. So we know we can put more housing in Yuba City and Marysville. That's good for many reasons.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific example. I want to shift a little bit and talk to you about, this is a conversation about housing and transportation, right? Housing, land use, and transportation. And so often these discussions occur in silos. Local land use planners have their domain, and our transportation agencies, state and transportation agencies, and our metropolitan planning organizations have their domain. How do we get these different perspectives to align a little bit more? Like it seems like they do on paper, but maybe not always in practice. I see Grecia nodding her head.
I tend to do that. Practicing deep listening. I'm really taking into what you're saying, but I do have some thoughts. Because, again, one of the things that makes Transform unique is that we do very much operate at the intersection. Including, my title is Housing Policy Manager, but I very much look at housing through a climate and mobility lens, with a special attention to how affordable housing near transit and high quality transportation options. But, in my experience in a previous life, I was a technical assistance provider for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities state grant program. I believe the deadline is today, so I'm sending positive thoughts to everyone submitting an application. So it's a state application. It provides a lot of dollars for affordable housing and transit investments, green infrastructure, et cetera. And it's a really special program because it does get all those players to come to the table and collaborate, because they have to come up with plans that make sense. So they're looking at the parcel and around the parcel and beyond it. So really creating this, looking beyond the parcel. So I think I think in the Bay Area, I will say we do a pretty good job in terms of, BAR and VTA, working on TOD. I think they do think beyond their stations, but it is a lift and it requires capacity. And I think if we continue to emphasize those opportunities where those different players can come together and work together, it's really wonderful when it does happen. But I agree that it continues to be the exception and not the rule per se. And I think there's a lot of reasons for why that may be. Everybody's really busy, and housing on its own is really hard, and public transportation on its own is really hard. But I think we are all starting to move towards an understanding that it needs to work together in tandem if we're going to figure out our housing. I hate to say crisis, but it's still a crisis. And to get, public transportation is so important in terms of not just the infrastructure, but also operations. But yeah, it has to happen. We have to keep capitalizing on those opportunities to come together.
Susan, I wonder if you can speak specifically on the transportation side of the equation and how our departments of transportation and other entities are evolving or maybe not evolving at the pace that we need them to.
Yes, good question. So as my students will tell you, my mantra is transportation and land use are inextricably linked, but institutionally they're siloed. And I think that explains a lot of the challenges we have, not just in California, but across the country. If you compare us to other parts of the world where there's more integration of the decision-making around these things. Recently, I've been saying our transportation problem is a housing problem. And I think that's true, but one thing I'm concerned about is that we are, well, I'm now seeing the argument being made that investments in the freeway system are a solution to our affordable housing problem. And this is especially evident with the Highway 37 project in the Bay Area, where it's part of the rationale for that. Well, there's a big resiliency rationale for doing something with Highway 37, but it's also being talked about as an equity project, that because so many workers can't, so many people who work in Marin and Sonoma counties can't afford to live there. So they're having to commute from Fairfield and even farther out, that we need to widen that highway to ease their admittedly ridiculously awful commute. So there are a lot of problems with that. For one thing, the widening isn't going to help as much as everybody thinks it's going to help. And then, of course, what's troubling is that we're putting so much money into this highway project when really we should be addressing the affordable housing problem, right? If we could put more affordable housing in those places, we wouldn't need the highway widening, and we wouldn't have the negative environmental impacts of that widening. But, you know, again, institutionally, everything is siloed. So money for transportation cannot be shifted to housing. And that's a reality we're living with, which, again, my ivory tower view, why don't we do something about this? James probably has thoughts about this.
Well, for all the policy and acronym nerds out there, I'm really glad we're both a council of governments and a metropolitan planning organization that lands for about 4 people. They actually understand what that means. But in other words, we do transportation and we do housing. That's sort of the way to describe it. And I have a lot of partner agencies who only do transportation. And we have a lot of bedroom communities in our region that are booming. And we need them, even in this day and age, post-COVID, we need more commercial, we need more industrial, we need jobs, we need manufacturing, or else if they're just bedroom communities, they're going to come to us for lots of money to widen those freeways. So because there's nothing there locally for those residents. And so that is still, even post-COVID, I think it's still a really big deal. Just to make sure we understand, I mean, we say our best transportation strategy is a housing strategy. Our best climate strategy is a housing strategy. So we spend a lot of time on this. But we still love transportation, don't get me wrong. People have to move.
Terrific. Well, we have an abundance of audience questions, and I'd like to move to those pretty quickly, but I'll ask just one lightning round question before we dive in, which is quite simply coming back to like the premise for this whole conversation is, what's the #1 thing that you would want California's decision makers to enact in order to accelerate our state's goals for new housing and or more sustainable transportation?
I guess I'll start. I think we actually have conflicting policy goals at the state level. And as I sometimes like to say, would the real California please stand up? It's very difficult to understand how to actually balance some of these goals. And I would also say that I think we have tons of grant programs and I love them all. We need more investment, absolutely, in housing and infrastructure to support housing and affordable housing. but there are so many, they are so hard to apply for. Our smaller jurisdictions, 2/3 of our communities, of our 28 cities and counties, they don't even bother applying for state grants to do infrastructure or housing because it is so difficult. So we'd like continued and ideally accelerated investment in infill housing and infrastructure, an easier way to get to those funds. And then my final piece on the funding would be, there tends to be, and this is a classic thing when I understand it, but a lot of state programs tend to like, and I love HSC, but they tend to be last money in. So you want to come in the very end, award the grant, make the project whole, or even award almost like a reward for the housing project, but there's no patient capital, there's no early money, there's no higher risk investment, which I think actually sort of turns off the spigot, if you will, for a lot of this infill and affordable that is so critical for us.
So I can go. Mine is actually similar, just to build off of that. I think a major barrier is all of the strings attached that come with this financing, making it very inaccessible, in particular for affordable housing, because market rate, I hear, I don't know, is easier, but still hard. And I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say one more thing, which is that it also needs to be all of this needed investment and infrastructure that's coming needs to be bundled with meaningful protections for existing residents and renters so that they can also enjoy the investments that come to their neighborhoods.
And I would add, on top of making it easier to build housing and affordable housing in particular, I would love to see authorization to do full lane pricing on our freeways and put a moratorium on freeway expansions. And there are ways to address the equity issues associated with things.
Terrific. Well, I'm going to start going to the audience questions now, and I think that note on equity is a good place to start. We acknowledging that this panel is full of white-collar professionals, and this first question is, have you accounted for type of work and class issues? For example, people in construction or trades typically can't afford to live in San Francisco or Palo Alto and have to drive from places like Oakley to get to work.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Sorry. So I think about this a lot in terms of, I feel like the easy answer is to say, we need more affordable housing. That's obviously not happening. Well, we hope it will. It needs to happen, right? So we need to have more affordable housing so that folks of different income levels and of different professions can live in the place of their choice. So we need it in different places. And then it also needs to be coupled with, when we think about building outside of the parcel, at Transform, we talk a lot about parking and reducing parking ratios and things of that nature. And I also am very mindful in my work that for me means that everybody needs to be a part of the conversation. When we bring investments to low income communities of color, we need to, it's easy to tell folks, it's good for you to be in a place that you can walk and bike. But some of these folks may need their pickup trucks, may need their vehicles for their economic well-being. And that needs to be accommodated. So there needs to be a conversation about what space are you willing to reallocate, because we know that we need less parking and we know that we need more affordable units. And we also know that you need this particular thing for your quality of life. So I think these conversations are starting to happen more and they're not happening enough, but I know that we're certainly thinking about it a lot.
It's again, it's a huge problem for us. And again, the sort of the satellite pull, if you will, of the Bay Area with people moving up here has driven housing prices up. We have had a pretty strong, generally speaking, middle class in our region, but that is shrinking. And suddenly, whereas a lot of families, multi-generational, had been living in places their families had owned or rented for quite a while, that displacement is beginning to happen. So we're beginning to feel those effects. And I think the solutions are challenging, but they're the ones that we have been talking about, which is trying to stabilize rental property, trying to minimize displacement, and trying to build new formats of housing that are, we have a lot of studios and one bedroom apartments going up. When we have attached housing, that's typically what we're getting. We're not getting larger, more family oriented places.
All right. Next up in our audience questions, this one's connects with some of the earlier conversation. So most zoning reform at the state level has been focusing on allowing more dense infill housing, but there's little about mandating local codes to allow community serving retail in residential zones as a way to reduce VMT with more complete communities. Any thoughts on non-housing zoning reform at the state level that can help create these mixed-use neighborhoods?
I'd love to know what our what our panelists think. I would just say I think, oh boy, so much has changed since COVID. Even though I said we still need jobs and we need jobs close to housing, but I think retail has been obviously really disrupted. And so where we would have said, yeah, we want locally serving walkable retail, especially from some of our newer suburban areas, that is just tougher. And I do worry, and I worry that we are actually over retailing, and that we are not giving enough flexibility. I mean, the city of Sacramento, and we're very proud. We have, I think, just percentage-wise, some of the most HCD designated pro-housing communities in the state. City of Sacramento just adopted a pretty new radical general plan that goes to floor area ratio. I don't exactly remember off the top of my head exactly how they treat retail and commercial and mixed use. So we need more mixed use. We need to be able to convert commercial and strip malls into housing. But I do worry about retail and requiring retail. I think it's much better for us to move into a more flexibility and flex space, because I just don't know what the future of retail holds. It does not look as strong as we thought it did just 4 years ago.
Yeah, totally agree. There's so much push for mixed use development in the form of housing above retail, but if we put retail at the base of every apartment building we're building, it's just way more retail space than we could possibly use. But another issue here, I think, is connectivity. So in a lot of suburban areas, there are strip malls, and there's retail, and there's services in reasonably close proximity to residential areas. But oftentimes the connectivity isn't there. So you have very indirect street connections, or you have to leave your comfortable little residential area, go out on the giant arterial to get to those kinds of services. So some good thinking about connections, especially for walking and biking from residential areas to the retail and service areas that do exist, I think could go a long way.
All right. Next up, we have a question. Which cities in California are having the most success with infill development? And what are the political or environmental factors that drive momentum?
Well, I wish they were all our cities, but I think been trying to give everybody a dose of reality. We have really good plans on the books. We have good general plans. We are trying to fund specific plans and EIRs to really, and a lot of community and neighborhood engagement. We actually just won a big USDOT Reconnecting Communities grant to do a lot of community engagement and equitable engagement, a lot of our disadvantaged communities around more infill and affordable housing. I wish I had a longer list, because it is just so hard to actually get it done. I think the city of, again, I would really give a lot of kudos to the city of Sacramento for both adopting a very ambitious general plan, but also the market is such in the city of Sacramento that they have been able to get more infill housing to happen.
Sacramento was one of the case studies I mentioned, or for the study that I mentioned at the outset that we did for the Air Resources Board, Santa Monica and Fresno being the other ones. And of course, what those places have in common is that they're pre-war communities to start with. Like where we're seeing change, I think, is more in the older areas, and obviously areas with good transit service. You know, I've been pretty impressed with the kind of change going on in the Bay Area around both Caltrain and BART over my lifetime. I mean, it's a long life, so it's slow change, but you know, there has been change. And I think you see some of the same in Los Angeles, in certain parts of Los Angeles. We're seeing that kind of densification and change that's hopefully helping with the housing problem, but also making helping with the VMT issue as well. But it does help if you have good bones to start with, right? You know, the right kind of transportation network and the right kind of development patterns to begin with. Or a lot of big parking lots that could be converted, I guess.
All right. So next we're going to shift from the local to the statewide perspective once again. And there were a series of questions about recent state laws, and I'm just going to kind of mix them all together and ask if the panel could talk about some of the state laws that have mandated parking space reductions, increased housing density, infill development, and mixed use housing opportunities.
Well, I will just say, I think it's maybe a little too early to tell if this is going to work, because again, change to the built environment happens slowly. But we are doing a lot of research on how the state policy is filtering down to changes in local policy. And that's, you know, that's the big challenge for the state. The state has certain goals it's trying to achieve, but it's dependent on local governments to change their policies. So how can the state best make local governments change what they're doing? So don't have the answers yet.
Yeah, so just to add to that, because there have been, just to name a few, at least related to parking, in terms of eliminating parking minimums near transit. And then there is unbundling that will happen for some counties in 2025. And I believe there's also some legislation around shared parking. But going off of what Susan just named, you know, it was a big win to eliminate parking minimums near transit specifically. So in areas where, you know, we know that it would be easier to maintain a quality of life without a card or lower vehicle use. However, local governments are still, who are typically in many cases funders for affordable housing developments, are still encouraging or including these strengths of including higher parking and higher parking ratios. And you know, I've heard a developer tell me directly, it's not in my best interest to go against what my funder wants. So I do think that there is like an element of advocacy that needs to happen to for developers or for more housing to be built without these parking ratios when it's not required and it is feasible to live well.
All right. Our next question, we may have time for one or two more. This next question speaks to a little bit of what Grecia brought up with regards to multifamily housing, particularly on the affordable side. The question is, new multifamily housing seems to shoulder the burden of all of our climate goals. So all electric or net zero requirements, bike parking, EV charging, etc. And while well-intentioned, raise the cost of developing infill housing, and thus less of it gets built. Are there any studies that analyze the amount of GHG reduction from the reduction of VMTs from infill housing creation versus the reduction from energy efficiency standards in buildings? And if you're not quite sure about the research part of it, maybe you could just talk more generally about how do we strike a balance between these goals?
Yeah, okay, so I will attempt, and then Susan and James, please chime in. So, you know, I agree. There is a lot of requirements, particularly on affordable housing, that is well-intentioned because there are these ambitious climate goals that we're trying to achieve. And they're not bad things. California as a state, I believe, has some of the highest green building standards in the country. So I do think that there could be a conversation around sharing this burden in terms of it not only being imposed on affordable housing, but also market rate and above moderate income buildings. And there is some studies actually that demonstrate that building. We're at Transform actually working on a white paper discussing how building affordable housing near transit does reduce VMTs and therefore contributes to GHG reductions. In particular for affordable housing, we know at the very low income level, folks tend to have a lower vehicle ownership. And so they should be prioritized for these areas.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit on this one too. So I mean, this is a big theme of the commentary that I was discussing in the beginning. And you can see more details there. But a lot of our climate policy is focused around reducing direct emissions. So how do you make sure this building isn't burning gas, or how do you make sure this vehicle isn't burning gasoline? But we have very poor handle on, if I don't build something here, whether it's new housing or wind turbines and solar panels, what additional emissions does that create? Because we're going to be burning more fossil fuels, or we're going to be building more housing in a higher emissions context somewhere else. There are a couple of studies on that you'll find in the commentary, including some by my colleague Chris Jones at UC Berkeley. But I think to get sort of the next level of granularity on trade-offs with some of these other restrictions or constraints we're putting on multifamily housing, that is something we want to do more research on at the Terner Center.
Thank you, Zack. 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask the question that's come up in a couple of different forms, but that's about our post-pandemic travel behaviors, and particularly around public transit, which has seen ridership drop off by around 40% across the state. How concerned do we need to be about this?
I'll start. I think really, really concerned. And not to sort of put our head in the sand and say, well, we just need to, just keep on doing what we've always done, because I think travel patterns have changed. Although as the state capital in our urban core, we are beginning finally to see more state agencies ask for their employees, their workers to come back, which is also very interesting from a VMT perspective. But I do think I really greatly worry about the future of transit. And I think we have to actually understand the shifts that are happening, not back away from our investment in transit, but maybe really rethink it. Certainly in our region, what that means is doubling down on the highest frequency routes, the routes that really have ridership on them, make them really good premium service, and then try to figure out a way to have more flexible micro transit point to point, which is more expensive per ride, but that's probably what it's going to take in a lot of our lower density communities to make it work. But I don't think we can keep on doing what we've been doing in transit.
Yeah, I think a positive outcome from the transit crisis that came out because of COVID could be some rethinking about how do we provide transit service and how can we do that better. I had some hope there for a while that COVID proved to everyone how important transit is when we had essential workers dependent on transit to get to their very essential jobs. That may have rubbed off a little bit, but it's really we've just got to make the commitment, right? I mean, transit doesn't have to be in crisis. If we as a public committed to making sure that we have good, effective transit systems, we would not have a crisis.
Yeah, so at Transform, we are intimately familiar with what is happening around public transit, and we are actively engaged in certain campaigns, including in a couple years will be, right now it's the regional housing measure, and then in 2026 we will be engaging in a regional transportation measure, with a particular emphasis on investments in operations, because public transit is not just like a nice to have, it's a need to have. It's something that any society should have as a public, something for the public. Public good would be nice, but anyway, maybe we'll get there. And then, yeah, I see, Chris, that you also mentioned maybe we can each say what is something we're excited about. So I'm hopeful. I am always the optimist. I am very realistic about our challenges, and I am hopeful that we can overcome them as a society, as a region, a state, a people. We have this regional housing measure that we will be voting on in November in the Bay Area, and it will be a game changer. It'll be historic.
I think that's a great note to end on. So I want to say thank you once again to our panelists. Thank you to the Terner Center for having us here. Again, the recording and slides will be posted online. And thank you to everyone in our audience for coming here and engaging and asking terrific questions.